All right, you're all being recorded here now. Um, so this is the last of the official scheduled classes, and I'm going to talk today about a piece that I'm not willing to let go of, namely the science and spirituality. But I also would love to do a post-class sort of community meeting of some sort, which would be about, and essentially would be about where do we, each of us or together, and what, where do we go from here? And I'm curious to know what people um, want to take with them from this class, what was helpful, what wasn't. But also, I want, it just seems to be a place where we can support each other, having been a little community for a while in wherever each of us uh, wants to go next, because we've sort of had an opportunity to experience each other and also to experience the gifts that each of us brings. And I think it'd be interesting to, I'd like to offer feedback on uh, my pleasure in discovering you guys and what I think you have to offer in your next stage. And I think that's something we can do for each other. So I would like to have one post class or one more class in the at the same time where
I
I
would
will
like
not
that.
be giving a talk. And it's and I like that. I probably we should just do it as another Zoom class because it's everyone can get to it, but I'm open to that being an in-person meeting in some meeting. So I don't know what.
I would just like to say that I looked one time, I think the first time it was to be in Lithia Park. I
Hmm.
drove back and forth and up and down. I could not find it, so I had to
Well,
give
I
up.
think I could give instructions that would be clear, but I'm kind of thinking for this, if we do it in person, let's do it in that conference room at the coffee shop, or let's do it on Zoom. What do people think? Do you first of all, who's interested in one more get together? Okay.
I honestly prefer Zoom because with the rise in COVID right now, the only way I could do it indoors is if we all took pre-tests when we came before
All
that
right.
day,
So we'll have
or we
one more.
all wore masks. And I want to see your faces. I don't want to see you in masks.
That
So,
settles it. Just let me say that settles it. So it'll be one more Zoom class, and then if people want to do some other
Okay.
any other forms of getting together in person afterwards, of course, they or we can do that. Okay. So that was the biggest order of business I wanted to do today. And I think I'm ready to give my little talk. And we are recording, and I am going to pin myself so that on the video, um, I'll be featured. Um, and here we go. So, greetings. This is class 9 of belonging to each other and the planet. And today's topic is spirituality and science and the relationship of the two. And in particular, my interest is in addressing what I consider a false polarization or dualism between science and spirituality. Now, as we've talked about the narcissistic paradigm, one of the things we've noted is that the duality or polarities are the hallmark of the narcissistic view, and the narcissistic view encourages us in every polarity to take one side, and attack the other. So it's about otherizing one of the poles. And that works for the powers that be because it keeps people divided and separated from each other and therefore distracted from the consolidated power of entrenched interests. Um, the and the major theme of the course has been a need for a transition from a paradigm of narcissism to what I've been calling a paradigm of communion. You could call it or holism, and if the hallmark of a paradigm of communion or holism is to treat polarities as two poles of a whole truth, and that you deal with the polarity by finding the underlying truth that unites and brings together both poles, as opposed to a war between the poles. So the metaphor then is sort of a conversation between the poles rather than a war between them. So, and the overall theme of this talk is that I think fundamentalist dogmatic religion, not true spirituality, but fundamentalist dogmatic religion, and materialist dogmatic science, not real science, but what I'm going to call scientism, so a dogmatic, doctrinarily materialist, simplistically materialist science, that both of those essentially take part in a desacralization of the world, a desacralization of the life process, and therefore a desacralization of us. And there's a lot at stake here in this because if the idea that we are in a crisis of belonging and that we are in the process of figuring out how to belong, a desacralization of nature won't do it. So the theme is we are not orphans. We are children of nature. Nature lives in us. We have been built by nature. We have within us the entire legacy of nature to guide us. And we are resourced by nature with the internal guidance of how to belong. We're not alone. We're not orphans. We are expressions of nature, which has figured out the process of how to belong, of how everything in nature can both be itself and belong, which has dealt with the polarity of separateness and belonging at every level of life since the beginning of life. So while the human experiment has pushed us to the edge, we are resourced by nature. We are resourced by nature and by our long evolutionary dialogue with nature. We are resourced to find our belonging. And in that process, nature is both a stern and a loving and supportive parent, if you want to call it that. Stern in the sense that the processes of nature hold us accountable for the effects of our actions because they affect us and they affect, they dissolve. When they're bad actions, they dissolve the ground of our being and the being of everything else. They are an attack on our own being. So nature is stern in that way. That is to say, we are accountable, and it is loving in the sense that it is resourcing us. It has, our whole existence is resourced by nature, and by tuning back into that is our only hope of refinding a healthy connection and belonging in the world. So now I'm going to talk about the two parts. First part is I'm going to talk about fundamental religion, and then I'm going to switch to talking about materialist, simplistic scientism, and I'm going to talk about how each of those takes part in desacralizing the world and therefore orphaning us from being resourced by life. Now again, so fundamentalist, dogmatic, doctrinal religion is not spirituality. So that's the first thing. I'm saying there's real spirituality, and I'm saying that fundamentalist, dogmatic, doctrinal religion counters and cuts us off from our spirituality. One way to think about that is that religion is you can think of religion as a goblet or as a container, and spirituality is the wine in the container. And when that particular some system of religious beliefs and rites to the extent that they are a worthy container for the spiritual experience and help us have the spiritual experience. To the extent that it's a worthy container, religion is doing what it ought to do, namely supporting spiritual experience. And when it comes at us with dogmas that cuts us off from the spiritual experience, then that container no longer is a valuable or appropriate container for the wine of the spiritual experience. When dogmatic religion cuts us off from spirituality, it serves power and it disempowers us, because it disempowers us from a direct experience of our spiritual source. So if belonging, as we've been defining it, is to take our place and be ourselves and fulfill our own potential on the one sense, and on the other to offer and contribute and receive sustenance and weave ourselves into the web of mutual dependencies on which on which life depends. If it's finding that balance, how can spirituality and science help us to belong? By overcoming that duality. What do fundamentalist religion and materialist science have in common is, I said this already, what they have in common is a desacralization of the natural world. So again, back to fundamentalism, or to dogmatic religion. If the spiritual experience is having a sense of awe and of gratitude and of humility and of surrender and service to something greater than us that is meaningful and sacred, if that's what the spiritual experience is about, is an experience of awe, gratitude, humility, then when dogma separates us from that experience, then the dogma has become anti-spiritual. One really good writer who's mentioned in the bibliography, in the reading list, is someone named Elaine Pagels, Pagels. I don't actually know if she pronounces it Pagels or Pagels. And she's written a couple of books that have been important to me. One is called The Gnostic Gospels, which is a description of some of the important gospels that got left out when the official Bible was put together. And another one is a book called Beyond Belief. And the basic theme of that book is that religion is not a set of beliefs, it's an experience. And when the beliefs support the experience, then religion is serving spirituality. And when those beliefs stand in the way of the experience, then they're an obstacle to our spirituality. And one of the things she talks about is what happened when. So just back to the bottle and wine thing, when the images or rituals or iconography or the convening of community serves spirituality, then religion's doing what it ought to do. And when it doesn't, it's not. So she talks about the birth of the official Christian religion. And she talks about the Council of Nicaea, which happened in 325 and led later to the Council of Rome, which was in 382 after Christ. And those were the meetings that convened and made official the Christian church. And this happened because Emperor Constantine, the Byzantine emperor, converted around in the 300s, converted to Christianity. And that led to Christianity becoming, for the first time, a state religion rather than a persecuted religion. And at that time, he convened the Council of Nicaea, and then that led to a process which uh, I think finalized more or less in 382 in the Council of Rome, finalized the official canon. That is to say, what of the Gospels that had been developed became official, were included in the Bible and became official Christian religion. Now, we're talking 300 to 400 years after Christ. And in those 300 and 400 years, there was an oral tradition and there was writings and a rather democratic, widespread, and anarchic, if you want to call it that, certainly not centralized, um, movement of people who in one way or other were inspired by Christ and were finding ways to grow and distribute their version of the teachings of Christ. But this is largely oral tradition and certainly not centralized. And it also included, by the way, a much greater role for women um, in that more anarchic and democratic stage. And so the purpose of the Council of Nicaea was, if we're going to be an official religion, was to essentially choose those religious doctrines that were compatible with an empire, compatible with being a state religion for a world empire, and getting rid of, expurgating those thoughts and beliefs and aspects of the unorganized Christian movement that were dangerous to the consolidation of power, which is to say that we're more democratic. So the emperor convened the Council of Nicaea, was the first stage of this, and their job was to decide what of the many Gospels ought to be legitimate and included in the official religion, and which were not. And a lot of what got left out were those aspects of those Gospels that were not compatible with the consolidation of power in an official church. So, for instance, two quotes that made a big impression on me that are from the Gnostic Gospels. One is this. These are supposedly quotes from Christ. One was, whatsoever ye do unto me, whatsoever ye do unto the least of these, ye do unto me. Supposed quotes from Christ. Whatsoever ye do unto the least of these, ye do unto me. So in short, when you're abusing anyone, you're abusing Christ. Okay? And I don't think, it's not at all clear that Christ ever said he was God, or that all these dogmas, until the Council of Nicaea, it wasn't clear that Christ was God, as opposed to someone like Buddha, who was like an enlightened human being who had a particular relationship to God because he had a particular ability to realize his connection with God and therefore to experience God within himself. And in that model, he's a human being who's saying, I'm a child of God. I experience God in me. And by implication, we are all children of God, and God is in all of us. And if you abuse any of us, you're abusing me. And if you abuse any of us, you're abusing God. So God is inherent in all his children. So that would be one view of what Christ was about, in which he's a prophet. Now, his elevation from prophet to God, and not just God, but to the one and only God, got consolidated in this period when the state religion was created. And another quote from the unincluded Gospels is, the kingdom of heaven is all around us, and ye see it not. The kingdom of heaven is all around us, and ye see it not. So in short, The kingdom of heaven is here. Life is sacred. And and if you want life to be the kingdom of heaven, you simply have to experience life in a spiritual way. You have to open your eyes and see, my God, we live in heaven. So, in short, the natural world and the physical world around us is sacred, is permeated by God. So those are those are not potential, those are radical views, and views not very compatible with the consolidation of spirituality into a bureaucratic system. And so those were left out. And the main decisions, the two most dramatic decisions were of the Council of Nicaea and a few following ones was, one, Christ is God. He's the one and only God, and Christ is apart from us. Christ's godliness in no way implies our godliness. Christ is the one and only God. I mean, there's a Trinity, but in the Trinity, he becomes part of the one and only God. And so his sacredness doesn't tell us that we're sacred, or his being a child of God doesn't tell us that we're children of God in the way that he is, and so forth. But the most dramatic thing, and it kind of blew my mind when I got clear on this, the Council of Nicaea declared that the age of revelation is over. The age of revelation is over. That is to say, the time when God has things to say to us, when God sends us messages, is over. God's done. God has told humanity everything he's ever going to tell us. And guess what? We, the church, are the guardians and the holders and the mediators, the holders of that truth. And if you want to know what God thinks, come to us, because we are the holders and receivers of everything that God has ever wanted to say to humanity and ever has. So the implication of that is this: if you think God is talking to you, if you have an experiential relationship to God, if you have a spiritual experience unmediated by the church, you're wrong, because God ain't talking to us anymore. It's the devil. If you think you have a spiritual experience, if you think you're having a direct communication with God, it's the devil who is fooling you, because we know that God ain't talking to us anymore except through the church. He ain't talking to you guys. Okay? So, in short, if you think you have a spiritual experience, you're a heretic. You're you're being fooled by the devil you're a heretic. And you will be dealt with.
It's called spam.
Yeah, that's right. It's spam. And you will be dealt with accordingly, which eventually.
Some were made saints.
What?
Some were made saints.
Uh-huh.
Catherine of Siena, St. John of the Cross.
Yeah.
There are a number who had direct spiritual experiences who were accepted.
Yes.
And they became saints.
Yeah. If it got authorized by the church, you would be a saint. But if it wasn't authorized by the church, you would be burnt at the stake ultimately. Okay. And if you were a woman, or a lot more likely, and if you were participating in any of the pre-Christian spiritual practices, any of the rites that were largely held, fostered by women, nourished by women, including like ecstatic dance. There's a wonderful book about that ecstatic dance, which was an important spiritual tradition, including Christian tradition. That, guess what? You were dancing to the devil's music. You were a witch. Okay. So separation from your body, separation from, any kind of direct spirituality. That's heresy. Um, so the point, oh, and then of course Saint Augustine was big on how essentially how our bodies and nature were profane and ultimately sort of dirty and ugly and needed to be seen as profane compared to the spiritual and the beautiful and the godly, which ain't here. It's up in some other realm, up in heaven. Um, so the point is, it separates us from spirit, from God, from direct personal access to spirit in us or in the world or in others, and it separates us from ourselves and from our bodies and from any pagan rites or any other types of rituals that people might have thought was providing them a spiritual experience or a connection to spirit. So the sacred is elsewhere. It's not in us. It's not in the world. Heaven's in another realm. God is outside. God's relationship to world is to be outside of it. God doesn't permeate existence. God is outside of it as a designer or a ruler or a monarch. So we're cut off from accessing our own inner guidance, accessing and feeling connected to our bodies and to nature. So that's the one polarity I'm talking about, the desacralization of the world through dogmatic religion. And it's not to say that religion can't serve a spiritual purpose, but and then the other side. So now it's a lot of liberals are much more comfortable at seeing that than seeing the way that materialist or dogmatic science desacralizes the world. So I'm now switching to that side. I'm not going to talk about materialist science. And as we did when I was talking about religion, you really have to distinguish here true science from what I'm going to call scientism or dogmatically materialist science. Because real science is a process and not a result. It's an ongoing model of building hypotheses that help us understand the world and of evolving those hypotheses by examining the effects of how well they help us understand the world and trying to increase our ability to understand the world as an ongoing process. Science oversteps itself. It oversteps when it presents its results as definitive facts and sets itself up as the arbiter of objective truth, not of a ongoing process of learning, but as an arbiter of objective truth. And when it does that, it invites a justified backlash. So I'm saying a lot of the anger and backlash to science right now, scientism, those aspects who, in the name of science, have operated in materialist and and in a dogmatic materialistic way, have rightly have invited a justified backlash. And I want to talk about that. So it's not, if we just dismiss the backlash to that as stupid, superstitious people who aren't willing to look at the truth, boy, we're really missing something. So here's some of the reasons why there's a backlash to science, to what calls itself science, what's presented as science. One is, it's pretty obvious, if science is presenting itself as the arbiter of objective fact and saying, look, we'll tell you the truth. People may have ideas and thoughts, but we know the truth. Then the most obvious thing is that people will notice sooner or later that the conclusions keep changing, and that the truth that science presented last 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, or last week, they're changing. Now, that's not a criticism of real science, because the conclusions ought to be changing. But if to the extent that science says, we know the truth, and if you want to know the truth, just listen to us. Um, to that extent, science is exposed when its sacred truths change. And I think we can all think of dramatic examples of that. Um, the other reason is, so that's one. Two, part of the backlash, because if science says the only thing that's true is things that are proven with a double-blind study, guess what? That means science can be easily used by those institutions, of which there are not many, who can afford to sponsor double-blind studies. So when I taught a environmental, was part of a team teaching and putting together and teaching an environmental course at undergraduate course at Berkeley. I guess in the early 80s it was. There's a man named John Goffman who was sort of really the world expert on he's a nuclear physicist and an expert on the relationship of radiations to cancer. This was a monumental man. So we had guest lecturers in this class. He came in and he was the guy. But he was a guy who studied Chernobyl, was sent there. He's really the world expert who wasn't directly tied to the nuclear industry, and therefore he was a rebel. And he said, look out for industry telling you there is no scientific evidence to prove blah 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 blah. There's no scientific evidence to prove that asbestos causes cancer, that tobacco causes cancer, that radiation, because that's a true statement if what they mean by that is there's no extensive, uncontrovertible, double-blind, blah, blah, blah study. Don't let them use that language on you, because it does not mean that it's not true. So just watch out for that language. And, for instance, this is me, there's not a scientific double-blind study to prove that if you jump off the Empire State Building, you will die. There's no scientific evidence that if you jump off the Empire State Building, you will die. There's never been an extensive double-blind study of that. Okay? So there's no scientific proof. So if you want to jump off the building, go for it, right? Anyway, so science gets used by those who can afford to pay for it. 3, that's the second one. 3, 3, 3 is all studies and conclusions are shaped by the questions that are asked, and thus by the hypotheses that are shaped by a cultural worldview. Again, this is not a criticism. There is no way to be exempt from cultural worldviews, and cultural worldviews need to evolve. And they will reveal truths and they will hide truths, and they have to evolve as it gets apparent that they're missing some truths that are important. So that's not a criticism, but it means that scientific truths and facts are not and cannot be, because they're human, cannot be free of a culturally worldview in which they're nested, which raises the questions that we're trying to understand. So it's never free of ideology. So the claim to be a truth, an objective truth, separate from ideology, is false. It's bad philosophy, bad theory of knowledge. So again, this is not wrong. This is not unavoidable. The cultural processes of how best to understand the world is an ongoing evolution and a testing process of our worldview, and keeps being tested by its actual results on the ground. What ways of looking at the world? What are the consequences of a certain way of looking at the world? Right now, we're experiencing a lot of the consequences. It's not a double-blind study, but we are experiencing in the world the consequences of the narcissistic worldview in action. Now, science, I think, though, provokes the strongest backlash the strongest resistance when it sets itself up in opposition to a spiritual view of the world. If science wants to base its claim to objectivity by saying we accept only measurable truths, we believe only those things that we have a hypothesis, we can measure it, and because we can measure it, we can say it's correct or not correct. If science says our truth is realer than yours, than anybody else's, than unscientific truth, because it is measurable, if science wants to do that, that's fine. But then stay in your lane. Because if your only authority is about measurable truth, then you have to be agnostic about those aspects of reality that cannot be measured. You have nothing to say. As a human being, you can think whatever you want. But as a scientist, you have no authority to have an opinion about non-measurable truths. You're trespassing on the subjects of life, on those subjects of life that cannot be measured. Now, science will then find ways to measure things that can't be measured directly, but that's then an indirect. Okay, so, and why this is really, really important. Well, let me give you an example. I think I talked about this already. I think it was Watson, either Watson or Crick, but I think it was Watson. I was going to look this up, but have not yet. But one of them said that he was refuting the theory of vitalism, which was a way of saying that there's a vital principle, a life principle, that there's a spirit, if you want to call it that, or a soul, but vitalism. And he said, that theory is wrong, and I know it's wrong because I'm a scientist, and I've looked at a microscopic level with an electron microscope at the basic structure of cells and atoms and life. This is the guy one of the two who discovered the double helix of DNA, right? Most important scientist, one of the most important scientists of his time and ours. I've looked, and there is nothing there besides the material. So, I mean, there's a great scientist, Nobel Prize winner. I don't know what else to call it, but stupid. My 11 or 12-year-old son, I told him this, and he said, what was he expecting to see? Little blobs with an S on it for spirit or V for vitalism? What was he expecting to see? So again, what that's missing is that the vitalism is not in the material parts, it's in the relationship between those parts, and that's what life is about, is a relationship of parts. So, but another reason why so it's circular reasoning, right? If you say the only thing that's real is material, and you look, and sure enough, everything you see is material, and therefore nothing else exists, an obvious circular reasoning. And obvious, it's just pure ideology. But here's why this is important. The more trivial something is, the more measurable it is. If you want to know how many bushels of wheat per acre a particular piece of land is producing, and how much more it produces if you put a certain fertilizer on it, that's pretty measurable. But if you're going to talk about love or purpose or meaning or beauty, those things that are really, really important, the more important something is, like love, purpose, meaning, beauty, the less measurable it is. Now, you can come up with proxy measurements. You can say, oh, we'll measure love by how many people get divorced, or we'll measure beauty by how many people prefer one picture to another. You can find ways, but you cannot directly measure. So when materialist science goes out of its lane, when it takes on the core of the spiritual view, which is that life has meaning, the core of the spiritual view, I think, is that life is meaningful, and that by participating in it, we are participating in something meaningful. When it takes on the core of the spiritual view, namely that life has meaning, it's out of its lane, and it produces a justifiable feedback. In fact, that's when it is desacralizing life. So to the question that does life have meaning, simplistic materialist science. Now, this is very different from the fantastic scientific work that's done about that understands that what we're trying to do is understand this miracle and relate to this miracle and have ways of discussing it that are meaningful to us, you know. But I'm talking about, again, the simplistic science. The answer to does it have meaning? The answer of materialist science is a resounding no. That nature and reality is essentially a random material process. It's blind. It's a blind, random material process. It has no meaning. It has no purpose, no soul or spirit, no direction, no learning, no cognition. And when we think it does, we are anthropomorphizing it. That is to say, we're projecting human values onto this material, this random material process. And in doing so, we are, okay. Now, there is actually a very good reason to be wary of anthropomorphizing, because tremendous damage is done by anthropomorphizing. So, for instance, if we project in the medieval system, just for example, if we project the medieval social structure, authoritarian social structure of king, noble lord, knight, peasant, and we project that onto nature, we're anthropomorphizing nature. We're projecting a social structure onto nature, and then we say that must be how nature is built. God, king, blah, blah, blah. And then we use that to justify that system. So there are absolute good reason to be wary of anthropomorphizing nature. But, give me a second here. There is a hidden and profoundly hubristic anthropomorphism hidden in the view that nature cannot have purpose, spirit, agency, cognition, meaning, because those are exclusively human characteristics. If you take that back, what you're really saying is you're defining purpose as what it means to humans. You're defining purpose, spirit, agency, learning, cognition, and meaning in human terms. And therefore you're saying doesn't apply to the non-human. But the profound hubris is that if you define those things as as their human version, ergo, nothing non-human or pre-human or more than just human or the whole, such as the planet, the ecosystem of the universe, nothing can have these exclusively human qualities. By definition, if those are all uniquely human qualities, by God, the world can't have it. The non-human world can't have it. So absent these human qualities, the material world has no meaning. It's a purely material and random process in this view. Therefore, like dogmatic religion, this worldview desacralizes any effort and, give me a second, desacralizes the world, and any effort to see a meaning to life is a superstitious delusion for those human beings who are not brave enough to face the cold, hard facts of life.
Would you repeat that?
Yeah. The materialist scientific view, like dogmatic religion, desacralizes the world. There's nothing sacred about the world. And any effort to see a meaning in life is a superstitious delusion for those people who aren't brave enough to face the cold, hard facts of the real world. The world is a machine, and if you have a problem with that and you project nice little sweetie thoughts to make you feel better about it onto it, you're just not willing to live in reality. You're superstitious. Now that view, of course, completely oversteps religious science's mandate, materialistic science's mandate. And this is what the backlash to science is reacting to, the basic view that life has no meaning. And people just aren't willing to swallow it, and they're going to fight for that.
Yeah, sure. I didn't know.
And whoever tells us that, is some kind of a modern egghead, elite, whatever, but they ain't me, and they're not going to run my life. So again, fundamentalist dogmatic religion says that, I'm just summarizing, so this may not be necessary. I just check my notes here. Fundamentalist, how they both desacralize earthly life. And fundamentalist dogmatic religion says that meaning is not in the world, not inherent in the world, doesn't permeate the world, spirit doesn't permeate, it's outside of the world in God. And we can fight over what the correct view of God is. And then we anyway, we can fight over what we think God thinks and encode our opinion about that into dogma and have wars about it or whatever it takes. But the world itself is not sacred. And on the scientific side, meaning is a superstitious fantasy for the weak-minded. So, can there be meaning, directions, intelligence in nature that can support us in our present crisis of belonging on the planet?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, well, so we can end it right there. Thank you. Is all the miracle of life simply a stage setting for the human drama? Do we just stand on top of the processes of nature? And are we thus alone in facing the crossroads we face, namely of how to belong? Or, so do we stand alone and are we unresourced? Or are we an ongoing participant in nature's process and thus resourced and able to access the guidance of nature's process and all the wisdom that life and nature have accumulated in constructing and building us, and that continues to be the ongoing ground of our existence, and that is therefore built into us?
We say that again?
Yeah. So are we orphans, or are we an ongoing participant in nature's process and thus resourced and able to access the guidance of nature's process, and all the wisdom that nature has accumulated in constructing and building us, and that continues to be the ongoing ground of our existence, that is built into us?
Yes.
The ongoing miracle of life. Can we be resourced by it? And that's really important, because if our dilemma is finding belonging, and if belonging is about finding the right relationship between selfhood and connection, nature has dealt with this issue. Nature has dealt with the issue that we face at every level of existence. Nature has dealt with and has been dealing with the problem that we face at every level of existence.
Why?
The problem of belonging, the problem of parts coming together and forming mutually beneficial relationships that join them into a greater whole, and that whole in turn having qualities that transcend the sum of the parts and thus form a new being that did not exist before, and the whole feeding back to make adaptive those parts of the whole whose way of being is compatible with the whole, with the needs of the whole, and sloughing off those parts that are not. I think I'll do that again. The problem of belonging, which is our crisis right now, we need to figure that out on the human level. On the pre-human level, the problem of belonging nature's been dealing with that issue at every level of existence prior to ours. The problem of belonging, the problem of the parts coming together, forming mutually beneficial relationships that join them into a greater whole, and that whole in turn having qualities that transcend the sum of the parts, that is to say, forming new beings that did not exist before, and the whole feeding back to make adaptive those parts of the whole whose way of being is compatible with the needs of the whole, and sloughing off those parts that are not. Our existence rests on the fact that nature has negotiated this process from the beginning of time and encoded the results in our DNA, in our body, in our emotions, in our instincts, in our hearts, in our guts, and our brains. For example, cells have, so there's a question, is there a wisdom? Is there a process? Is there a wisdom? Is there a cognition going on at the catch that, right? At the pre-human level. These are our ancestors we're talking about, right? Something we can learn from our ancestors. So for example, the cell has a semi-permeable membrane. That's very important, both parts of that. If it was completely permeable, it wouldn't have a separate existence. If it was impermeable, it couldn't be nourished or get rid of what it needs to get rid of and would die. So the semi-permeable membrane is essential for its separate being, and but it has to let through in and out what it needs. So the process of a cell forming a tissue is a cell making an alliance with another tissue and finding out which other cells it wants to make an alliance with and which it doesn't, essentially. And once there's a tissue, again, those cells that are compatible with the tissue are adaptive and the others are sloughed off. An example of that is a cancer cell. A cancer cell will be excluded from a healthy body because it's selfish, because when it wins, the organism the coherence of the whole organism breaks down, the organism dies, and thus the cells die. So in some ways, it's stupid. It's greedy and selfish and stupid, if you want to call it. It doesn't know how to play with others. So let's say the cancer cell says, if I want to win, I want to expand. See all these liver cells? I'm going to turn them into cancer cells, and then I'll be winning. Well, guess what? Ultimately, the body needs the liver. You kill the liver, you kill the body, the cancer cell dies. So that's an analogy to an antisocial individual who needs to be left on the ice floe because they're not compatible with the survival of the tribe, or a species that destroys its ecological support system. Now, what's cool, my friend Peter. Go ahead.
The species today is the human species that's destroying everything.
That's right. That's right. So can the human species not operate as a cancer cell, but operate as a healthy cell in a larger organism? Right, exactly. So Peter sent me an article that is really cool. This is big time scientific breakthrough work. So this is making it into the scientific, the real, not the materialist, simplistic scientific. It's a counter to that, actually, but this is a discussion within the scientific community. And so I am going to see if I can put it up here. Give me a second. Yeah. And I think I need a screen share for this to work. Screen share. Can you guys see some text now on your screens?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is, I'm going to read you this in a minute, but just to introduce it, this is an article called Cognition All the Way Down. Cognition All the Way Down. It's an article by Michael Levin and Daniel Dennett, and it appeared in something called AEON. Now you can Google that. I'm talking about this is actually the top part, this part here. But we'll look at that in a minute. I'm just going to introduce it first. So, but you can look up AEON, Google it, and seems to be a very cool publication and organization. Anyway, the article,
quote by De Blasio.
Say what?
I only see a quote from Damasio, so I'm not
Yeah,
understanding.
I have, so I'll direct you to this in a minute. Let me just, I'm going to stop the screen share and just,
Oh, okay,
so I'm
got
going to I'm referring to an article called Cognition All the Way Down. And it says the next great horizon in biology is to understand cells, tissues, and organisms as agents with agendas. Right? So being an agent and having cognition is not an exclusively human quality. And another quote from this article that I'm going to show you a piece of in a minute. The point is not to anthropomorphize morphogenesis, not to anthropomorphize. Morphogenesis is the process of creating biological forms. So the point is not to anthropomorphize the creation of, not to anthropomorphize morphogenesis. The point is to naturalize cognition. The point is to naturalize cognition. And now I'm going to push my screen share. And I'm going to, let me just do it like, I'm just going to do the top, this one. So in blue, the bottom part there says, instead of treating human, there's a long article that I recommend, I'll send you, but you'll also find if you Google AEON. Instead of treating human genius as a sort of black box made of magical smart stuff, we can reinterpret it as an explosive expansion of the bag of mechanical but cognitive tricks discovered by natural selection over years, over billions of years. Someone once you guys all turn off here while we're talking until you're ready to say something yourself, mute yourself because I'm hearing background noises. So instead of our human genius being a separate thing, you can reinterpret it as an explosive expansion of the bag of mechanical but cognitive tricks discovered by natural selection over billions of years. By distributing intelligence over time and space, I'm going to jump a little bit, time and space, we're talking not just of smart brains and smart neurons, but of smart tissues and cells and proofreading enzymes and ribosomes. The mystery of life can be unified in a single breathtaking vision. And the next quote down here is by Antonio Damasio. Antonio Damasio is I think pretty much the scientist of the relationship of the physical brain to the mind, the relationship of brain as a biological physical object and mind as an experience. And he says, I'm going to just read the blue parts. Unminded intelligence, intelligence that isn't in a brain or in a human mind, unminded intelligence precedes the variety of intelligence based on minds by a few billion years. Unminded intelligence is concealed in the depths of biology. Unminded intelligence is well hidden behind the workings of molecular pathways that accomplish smart things for living organisms. Unminded intelligence manifests itself widely in reflexes, in habits, in emotive behaviors, in competition and cooperation among organisms. Be mindful of the mindless. Please realize that we, lofty and minded humans, also benefit from unminded intelligence mechanisms at all hours of the day. So basically, it's a way of reintegrating ourselves and what we do to the biological roots. The biological roots of what we do, and therefore reclaiming our belonging. So in this view, we are neither kings of the world nor abandoned orphans, but members of life. And in this view, we can find our belonging as good citizens of life. We are not orphans if we humble ourselves enough to learn from our elders, if we don't orphan ourselves. And this brings to my mind the idea of human development. If you think of the development of a human individual, there's sort of a stage of undifferentiated, in the womb and in an infant, there's sort of undifferentiated belonging in the world. And if you think of a teenager, you think of that's the height of the process where we're differentiating ourselves. How am I not like my mother or my father? And how don't I believe what I was taught? And then the process of being a mature adult is actually finding you call it a re-belonging in the world. And this is what we're talking about. How do we as a species find an adult belonging in the world? Which is our quest to balance the experience of being separated and being connected. And then death is to be dissolved and reabsorbed in an undifferentiated belonging, where our parts distributed and we go back to the whole, but we're no longer our differentiated selves. So if you take that model of growth and maturity to the species, there would be undifferentiated belonging where we were experienced our connection with the world in the same way that animals do. There's the process where we said, no, we're humans. We can do this. We can do that. Look how wonderful our tricks are. We're sort of in that process right now. The teenage process, the immature process of look at us. And how do we grow up where there's a re-belonging, where we find the balance between being ourselves and being part of? Can we grow up and achieve a differentiated belonging in the world? So looked at in this way, we can recognize that intelligence, learning, reaching, striving, connecting, forming relationships, forming alliances, creating new wholes, co-creating networks, creating ever greater wholes and networks. These are not exclusively human inventions. That is something that we could call a striving or a direction or an intelligence intrinsic in the process of life that underlies and transcends the human version of these, that permeates life. An ancient process of life that underlies our existence. A miracle that deserves and requires us to treat it as sacred. That the whole thing is a miracle that deserves, and the hard side of that is requires us to treat it as sacred. This is the sacred ground of our belonging to ourselves, to each other, and to the spirit that unites all things, the spirit that unites existence. And that's the end of my little talk here. Where are we at? We got about a good 20 minutes left.
I hope you're going to send a recording of this.
Yes, I am.
There were some words that were a little difficult.
Well, I'm going to send 2 recordings actually, because I did a practice round of this talk, without audience, and I'll send them both, and
Thank you.
See which one works better. So the experiential parts of this class, which I think might have worked better if this was an in-person class, but the meditations and the checking in and experiencing life in ourselves, the intention of that is to have a direct experience of our belonging, right? A direct experience of our spiritual connection.
Yeah, maybe you needed an extra half hour.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Because
I allowed more time.
Yeah, I think I would do that next time. That's a good suggestion. And so it's part of why I want to have another closing get together. Because I want that. I want to be able to say what I want to say, but I also want a time to share and I also want to help
Well, I
support.
appreciate very much those references that you gave that came from Peter
Yeah, that was
here in
great.
class. Yeah, I sure like to read those.
Yep.
I've often thought of the intelligences that are on this planet, whether
Yeah.
they're dolphins or octopuses or whatever form they take, elephants. There's
Slime
a lot
moles.
of wisdom in a lot of it, and I
Yeah.
think a systems view of the world as opposed to the reductionistic view
Right.
actually is very compatible science and gives a scientific explanation of some of these things that is more than I can get into now, but I've
Yeah.
thought about this quite a bit. And it prevents some of this. I've looked into it, and the scientist who said he was not able to find any evidence of life by reducing, looking at the tiniest thing and hoping to find something tangible there when that's just the essence of reductionistic thinking,
Right.
as opposed to a systems view, which is leads to very connected kinds of thinking perspectives. I've been interested in this for decades. So
Yeah. And I appreciated your sharing some of that with us.
Can you give us that Google address for the
Just Google
Antonio
AEO.
Damasio?
Just Google Damasio and Google
Damasio,
AEON.
AEON. Okay.
AEON. And the article is called. I can send you links, but you don't need to wait on that. The article is called "Cognition All the Way Down," which I think is a great title.
Okay.
Um,
I
I think.
know I've been very interested. I love trees, and I love the work of, I think it's Susan Sinard, who has talked and done research on
Right.
how trees are interconnected and how they help each other, how they communicate with each other.
They help feed each other.
Yep.
Yeah, they do. So, I mean, that is all similar to what you are discussing
Right.
in terms of other wisdoms.
It's been fun for me because these are ideas I've been cooking for a long time, and then it's like, oh, like her book or a lot of this other material go like, oh, woo, cool, look at how much is being done by people who have much more specialized credentials for what they're talking about. And her stuff is fantastic. I have her on the reading list, and I just got a book version, which if it isn't already on there, I'll put on there.
Finding the Mother Tree.
Yeah, that's right. Finding the Mother Tree is her book. But if you don't want, you don't have to read a whole book. She has some TED Talks that are very succinct and poignant, and
They're
some
much
articles.
easier.
Yeah, and her
The
first,
book is very,
she
very
first,
sciencey.
yeah, she first got. I mean, she wrote an article that's first sort of broke this way of looking at the world.
And who are you talking about?
Susan Simard, I think,
Oh,
Simard. Well, if you look at the
MARD.
bibliography, you'll find her on there, the reading list. I could share an experience and move that into a sort of closing meditation-y kind of thing. And then we get to do all the talking we want. And just sort of a community meeting next time. Would that be a way to go?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Um, I had a stroke 5, 6 years ago. It's what they call a TIA, which is to say a stroke that doesn't leave any permanent uh, symptoms. So I
Right.
believe myself to be fully functional. Um, but what happened was I was with my wife. We were coming back from a weekend on the coast, and then we went and hiked in the redwoods. We actually separated for part of that hike, and when we came back together, I said to my wife, and we got in the car and started driving home. And I said, "Can you orient me? What's going on? Where are we?" And she said, "What?" And I said, "No, where are we? What's happening?" And she said, I guess she felt something along the lines of "Holy shit," and call, called an ambulance, and they took me to the nearby hospital on the coast. And so I was unconscious for a period of about 4 hours. I have no memory of that time. Um, and when I woke up, there was my wife, and I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, it was interesting. You were doing this thing that they telling me is called a broken record thing, where you would ask me the same question every 4 or 5 minutes, and I would answer it, and then you would ask me the same question again. And what you mostly did was you kept asking me to orient you, and I did that a few times, and after a while, I gave up because it wasn't doing anything for you." Um, and she said, "But you kept," and then she said, "And you kept saying the same thing to me. You kept saying to me how much you loved me and accepted me and were grateful for me, and that you wanted me to know," she's talking to me, "you wanted me to know that my love for you had been fully received and accepted." And she said, "And you said that over and over again." And this is my wife. You have to know her. This is so cool. She says, "At first, it was kind of annoying." And she looks at me and she says, "And then you got to me." And she says, "And then I realized what you were saying was, this is what matters. This is the only thing that matters. This is what needed to be said. And this is what needs to be said. And it's the only thing that needs to be said." So a joke I made afterwards was, if I said the same thing every 4 minutes for 4 hours, my idea of what was important to say must have been pretty robust. Uh, so, but the part I actually want to share here is, when I woke up, I had a experience, a vision, whatever. I don't want to make it something woo-woo. It just, I had a perception or a vision or thing. And the perception was this. My perception was that I was the center of the universe, or that here in my solar plexus was the center of the universe. Except every place was the center of the universe. It wasn't like me being special, but this was the center, or my center of the universe. And from that center, and then the picture, the Leonardo da Vinci picture of the man, uh, long-haired man with his legs spread and his arms spread and his fingers spread. Anyway, so it was like that that I had here in me a center of the universe, and that everything in me was reaching out for everything else. And that everything was the center of the universe, its own center of the universe, and everything was reaching for everything else. And I got this image of the repeated pattern, this dendritic pattern, of blood vessels, of fingers, of hands, of tree branches, of leaves, of the veins in trees, of deltas, of water running, collecting and running to the ocean. That this pattern, and I'd love to, put together like a bunch of pictures that would just show that this pattern, which is everything in the universe reaching for everything else in the universe, was essentially the architecture of existence.
Mm.
And it's interesting how that fits into, like, the thing that I quoted, that the cognition all the way down, all this stuff. So I'm not claiming this as being this was a normal waking experience at this point, except that I was just coming back from being in a unconscious state. So I'm wondering if that would be the basis for a little meditation.
Yeah.
Okay. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. And sense into yourself and see if you can find in yourself something that feels like the core or the center of your being. For me, that's in my solar plexus, but it could be wherever you experience, for the moment, the center of your being, of your experience of yourself. And notice the vibrations and the rhythms and the vitality. Notice every way that you're able to experience your very own center, whatever is the core of your you-ness. And then imagine that living core radiating out into the world. And you can do a movement with this if you want, or just picture it. The center of your living coreness reaching out into the world, radiating out into the world, and reaching and yearning and connecting you with everything else in the world. And see if you can experience both your giving of yourself and your sharing of yourself and your surrendering yourself and your offering of yourself to the world. And if you leave yourself in that vulnerable offering place, can you experience the world receiving you? Can you experience all the ways that the world and all the separate beings in the world are reaching for you? As David White would say, everything is waiting for you. Can you experience yourself being accepted and received by the whole natural world and the whole universe and all of being? And in that, can you experience your connection and yourself as being interwoven, inextricably interwoven with all of existence? And if you're able to do that for a moment, what would it be like to experience your whole life with that level of belonging? Because this might be the place where you get to be exquisitely yourself and exquisitely connected, and where the tension of that dichotomy is resolved in a full citizenship of existence. When you're ready, in your own time, come on back into the room with a soft focus. And when you're ready, look around and look at the excellent company that you are in here. And we got 6 minutes left for anything anybody wants to share or say.
I'd like to mention the eclipse.
Yeah.
I went out in my backyard with my binoculars and I couldn't even comprehend what I saw. The moon was red and it was gigantic. I'd never seen anything like that before in my life, and I felt one with the universe. Incredible.
It's incredible when we see, that those moments when we see things with new eyes, with innocent eyes, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
There's a tribe that separated the people who they were expecting to grow into their shaman, and those kids spent the first 7 years of their life in a cave. They weren't isolated. They were very much in community. They weren't, but they didn't. Their social life happened in the cave. And the point was that when they came out of the cave at age 7, they were just staggered by the beauty of it all. They were just slain by the beauty of it all. So what they cultivated was human beings who got it. What an incredible miracle this all is. Who didn't grow up taking it for granted. And that for them, for this tribe, was the core experience, the core grounding experience necessary to be a shaman to the rest of their people. Like, I'm going to try and drink this coffee as though I've never tasted coffee before.
Or smell a rose.
Yeah.
Like you've never smelled it before.
Right.
I keep the petals when they're all dropping off, but they have the scent. And I just smell it. It's just amazes me.
Yeah.
It's all a miracle.
It really is.
That's what it is.
Yeah. And so if we're going to be warriors for it, then that has to be grounded in our love and appreciation and allowing ourselves to be nourished by it.
Sorry, I need to take off. I'll look forward to your email about a last kind of class of conversation. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye, Sean. So
I've appreciated this class quite a bit.
Oh, good.
I don't want it to end.
For one.
Say what?
I don't want it to end.
Karen, just finished.
The class to end.
Oh, that's so
I just
good.
said to find a kindred spirit for one.
Yeah.
And Nina, it's good to see you. I really
Karen.
enjoy being together with you in this class, as well as our other connection.
Our other group.
Yeah.
You guys are in a different group together also?
We are.
The Explorers.
Explorers group.
So I am going to send out the class list for people that people can use to network in any particular way they want. I'm gonna I'm gonna send it out a thing giving everyone say 3 days to tell me they don't want to be on it, and then I'll pass it out to the class as a whole.
Fine, it's fine.
So you're gonna do this again in the fall? Or you
This
don't
is
know
I'm going to do it again. I haven't decided actually. I've done it. This is the third or fourth class. They've
Oh,
all been Zoom, so I haven't quite decided. I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something again, and that's part of why I'm interested in lists, because I want to cultivate a list of people who might be interested in whatever I decide I want to offer. And
if we can ever get past the COVID thing
yeah,
and really
Yeah,
get together in safety.
and
Yeah.
I have been pleasantly surprised by how much community we've been able to communicate to have all with Zoom. In some ways, it's powerful because you're right in each other's faces. You know that in some ways
That
it's
is true.
it's something intimate about the Zoom. But I haven't figured out yet exactly what I would do. You know what the live version would be. Um, So I might be very interested in people's inputs about if I have ideas about what I would want to offer. I might use you guys as a sounding board for what sounds good.
it'd be nice if we could have it outside. For instance, it's like a gazebo at North Mountain Park, the
Yeah,
round,
yeah,
to be outside.
yeah,
This class would be nice.
And also, if you've taught this 3 times before, and if there are people who have come in from those for all of the classes to get together,
yeah,
sometimes that is pretty amazing also.
yeah. I think that would be yeah, um, yeah, to sort of
That's how I met my
convene the
husband.
community of people who are interested who've been through this and maybe not
Yeah,
just do the same thing, but figure out what a next step would be that would work.
yeah.
Um, and they've been lovely. Every class has had a lovely, small but lovely community of people. Pretty incredible bunch of folks, I have to say. And
That's
on
great.
on my part, um, it's kind of humbling that these amazing people are willing to come.
Every time you mention Berkeley,
Uh-huh.
I lived there for 37 years.
Yeah, yeah,
I get nostalgic every time you mention
yeah,
it.
yeah.
All through the 60s, I was there.
That was a hell of
Well,
a
I'm
place
gonna
to
All the
say
be.
protests.
I have to leave, so
Okay.
we'll be in touch.
All right. I will close it out.
Okay,
And
thank
so
you.
goodbye, my dears.
Be safe.
You too.